I'm Emma Rodriguez, 28 years old, and 3 weeks ago I thought I understood exactly how my family operated. Sure, we had our problems, but blood is blood, right? That's what I kept telling myself every time they dismissed my concerns, ignored my suggestions, or treated me like the family disappointment who just couldn't get her act together. Then came Thanksgiving dinner at my brother Ryan's sprawling house in Paradise Valley, where I found myself literally being escorted to the front door by my own father, while 15 relatives watched in stunned silence. The reason for my dramatic exit? I had dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, we should include our 83-year-old grandfather in our holiday celebration instead of leaving him alone at Sunrise Manor while we carved turkey and counted our blessings. Apparently, that made me a troublemaker, a mood killer, someone who couldn't just let the family enjoy their perfect Norman Rockwell moment without dragging reality into the picture. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What none of them knew as they watched me walk away that evening, my cheeks burning with humiliation and my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak, was that just 2 weeks earlier, Grandpa Joe had asked me to become the executor of his estate. $720,000 in assets, investments, life insurance, and real estate that my family had been eyeing like vultures circling a carcass for the past 6 months. And now, thanks to their spectacular display of callousness, I was about to use that power in ways that would send every single one of them into panic mode. You see, being an executor doesn't just mean you get to distribute money when someone dies. It means you control every financial decision, every asset transfer, and every inheritance distribution until you decide the beneficiaries deserve what they're expecting. And after watching my family kick me out for having the audacity to care about an elderly man's feelings, I was beginning to think they didn't deserve much of anything. That went wrong. Growing up in Phoenix with my older brother Ryan was like living in a constant comparison experiment where I was always the control group that proved his superiority. Ryan was everything our parents, Linda and Mike Rodriguez, had dreamed of in a son. He was the quarterback who led Desert Ridge High School to state championships, the business major who graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State University, and the golden child who seamlessly transitioned into the family plumbing supply business that my father had built from nothing over 25 years. I, on the other hand, was the sensitive kid who spent lunch periods in the library instead of the cafeteria, who chose social work as a major despite my parents' obvious disappointment, and who seemed to have inherited all the inconvenient traits that made family gatherings awkward. While Ryan learned to schmooze with contractors and suppliers, perfecting the art of backslapping and deal-making that made my father beam with pride, I was drawn to the messier, less profitable work of helping families navigate crisis situations and advocating for people who couldn't always advocate for themselves. The contrast became more pronounced as we entered our 20s. Ryan married Ashley Camden, a polished real estate agent with blonde highlights and a wardrobe that cost more than my monthly salary. They bought a 5-bedroom house in Paradise Valley with a 3-car garage, a pool, and enough square footage to host elaborate dinner parties that always seemed to revolve around business connections and networking opportunities. Their 2 children, 7-year-old Madison and 9-year-old Connor, were enrolled in private schools and weekend activities that cost more than some families spend on rent. Meanwhile, I was living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Tempe, driving an 8-year-old Honda Civic, and working for Maricopa County Child Protective Services for $38,000 a year. My job involved investigating reports of child abuse and neglect, connecting families with resources, and occasionally having to remove children from dangerous situations. It was emotionally draining work that required long hours, difficult conversations, and the kind of mental resilience that doesn't show up on a resume or impress people at cocktail parties. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my professional life advocating for vulnerable people, while my own family treated me like someone whose opinions carried less weight than the catering staff at their social events. Every family gathering followed the same script. Ryan would regale everyone with stories about his latest business successes. Ashley would discuss her real estate deals and the impressive commissions she was earning. And my parents would swell with visible pride as they talked about their son's achievements and their daughter-in-law's professional accomplishments. When the conversation inevitably turned to me, the enthusiasm would drain from the room like air from a punctured balloon. My mother would offer a tight smile and mention that I was still helping families in that tone people use when discussing someone's hobby, rather than their career. My father would nod politely and change the subject to something more substantial, like Ryan's plans to expand the business or Ashley's latest luxury listing. The only person in our extended family who seemed to understand that my work mattered was Grandpa Joe, my mother's father. Joseph Martinez had been a high school English teacher for 42 years before retiring, and he possessed the rare combination of genuine curiosity about other people's experiences and the patience to actually listen to the answers when he asked how you were doing. While everyone else at family gatherings treated me like an afterthought, Grandpa Joe would pull me aside and ask detailed questions about my cases, offering insights from his decades of working with teenagers and their families. Grandpa Joe had been living at Sunrise Manor, an assisted living facility in central Phoenix, for 3 years following a mild heart attack that convinced him he shouldn't be living alone anymore. The facility was nice enough, with landscaped courtyards, scheduled activities, and staff members who genuinely seemed to care about the residents' well-being. But it was still an institutional setting, and Grandpa Joe often talked about missing the rhythm of his own life, his own kitchen, his own routines that had anchored him through nearly 8 decades of living. What struck me as particularly cruel was how quickly my family had adjusted to Grandpa Joe's absence from their daily lives. Within months of him moving to Sunrise Manor, their visits became sporadic and brief. My parents would stop by on major holidays, staying just long enough to fulfill their filial obligations without having to engage in actual conversations about how he was adjusting to facility life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ryan and Ashley visited even less frequently, usually bringing the kids for perfunctory visits that lasted exactly long enough for Ashley to take photos she could post on social media to demonstrate what a caring family they were. I, however, had fallen into the habit of spending most Sunday afternoons at Sunrise Manor. What had started as weekly duty visits to make sure Grandpa Joe wasn't being neglected had evolved into the highlight of my week. He was one of the few people in my life who seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences, who asked follow-up questions about the families I was trying to help, and who offered the kind of perspective that only comes from having lived through decades of watching people navigate life's challenges. Our Sunday routine rarely varied. I would arrive around 2 in the afternoon, usually bringing coffee from his favorite shop and whatever pastries had caught my eye that morning. We would sit in the community room or, when the weather was nice, on the covered patio overlooking the small garden that several residents had volunteered to maintain. Grandpa Joe would ask about my week, and I would find myself sharing details about my work that I rarely discussed with anyone else. He had a way of helping me process the emotional weight of dealing with families in crisis, without offering simplistic solutions or dismissing the complexity of the situations I encountered. When I told him about having to remove children from homes where parents were struggling with addiction, he would nod thoughtfully and share stories about students he had taught whose home lives were chaotic, helping me understand that sometimes the most caring thing you can do is create boundaries that protect people from destructive situations. These conversations weren't one-sided. Grandpa Joe would tell me about his week at the facility, the other residents he had befriended, the activities he enjoyed, and the ways he was finding meaning in this new phase of his life. He had become something of an unofficial social coordinator among the residents, organizing card games and movie nights, and helping newer residents adjust to communal living. His stories painted a picture of a vibrant community of older adults who were supporting each other through the challenges of aging, creating connections that enriched their daily lives in ways their adult children often failed to recognize. The more time I spent at Sunrise Manor, the more I began to understand that my family's approach to Grandpa Joe's care was not just neglectful, but fundamentally misguided. They treated his residence there as a problem to be managed, rather than a life transition that deserved support and engagement. When they did visit, their conversations focused on logistics rather than relationship. How was he feeling physically? Was the staff taking proper care of him? Did he need anything from the outside world? These were certainly important questions, but they missed the deeper reality of what it meant for an independent person to navigate the psychological and social adjustments of communal living. My family's attitude toward Grandpa Joe's situation reflected their broader approach to problems that couldn't be solved with money or connections. They were comfortable writing checks for his care, satisfied that they had fulfilled their responsibilities by ensuring he was housed in a decent facility with adequate medical supervision. But they seemed incapable of recognizing that what he needed most was ongoing emotional connection, regular visits that weren't rushed or obligation-driven, and family members who were interested in his thoughts and experiences rather than just his physical well-being. This pattern became even more pronounced as Grandpa Joe's health began to decline slightly over the past year. Nothing dramatic or immediately concerning, but the gradual changes that come with aging. His mobility decreased somewhat, requiring him to use a walker for longer distances. His energy levels fluctuated more than they had previously, meaning some days were better than others for extended conversations or activities. His hearing, never perfect, became more challenging, requiring patience and clear communication from visitors. Rather than adapting their visiting patterns to accommodate these changes, my family's visits became even more infrequent and perfunctory. My parents would call ahead to ask the staff how he was doing, as if the nurses could provide a comprehensive report on his emotional and social well-being. Ryan and Ashley would send cards and flowers for holidays, apparently believing that tangible gifts could substitute for personal presence and attention. The contrast with my Sunday visits became more stark as I witnessed how Grandpa Joe's face would light up when I arrived each week, how he would save up stories and observations to share with me, and how our conversations seemed to provide him with intellectual stimulation and emotional connection that the facility's structured activities couldn't fully replace. I began to realize that my weekly visits weren't just something I was doing for him. They were becoming essential to my own sense of family connection and personal grounding. During our conversations over the past several months, Grandpa Joe had begun expressing concerns about his family's priorities and values that went beyond simple disappointment about infrequent visits. He would make observations about Ryan's increasing focus on material success and status symbols, wondering aloud whether his grandson understood that professional achievements weren't the only measure of a life well lived. He would ask questions about Ashley's apparent discomfort with spending time in institutional settings, trying to understand whether her avoidance of Sunrise Manor reflected squeamishness about aging or deeper issues with empathy and social responsibility. Most significantly, he had begun talking about his worries regarding how his family would handle his eventual death and the inheritance he would leave behind. These weren't morbid conversations, but rather the thoughtful reflections of someone who had lived long enough to understand that death is a natural part of life, and that the way families handle end-of-life transitions reveals fundamental truths about their values and relationships. Grandpa Joe had worked steadily throughout his teaching career, lived modestly, invested wisely, and saved diligently. His house in Central Phoenix, purchased in 1978, had appreciated significantly in value over the decades. His pension and Social Security benefits had allowed him to maintain his lifestyle without dipping into his savings during retirement. His life insurance policy, originally intended to protect my grandmother who had passed away 12 years earlier, remained intact. Combined with his investment accounts and modest but steady savings, his estate totaled approximately $720,000. This was not generational wealth by any stretch of the imagination, but it represented A lifetime of careful financial management, and the kind of nest egg that could make a meaningful difference in his family members' lives. What troubled him, based on conversations he had overheard and comments family members had made during their brief visits, was that his children and grandchildren seemed to be counting on this inheritance as part of their own financial planning, rather than treating it as a potential gift that might or might not be available to them. He had noticed that my parents had begun making comments about their retirement plans that seemed to assume his financial contributions. Ryan had mentioned several times that he and Ashley were considering upgrading to a larger house, noting that they were waiting for some financial changes that would make such a move feasible. Even more concerning to him were conversations he had overheard between family members about his care costs and their apparent resentment about the monthly fees at Sunrise Manor, as if his decision to remain in a facility that provided quality care and social engagement was somehow selfish or financially irresponsible. These observations had led Grandpa Joe to begin questioning whether his family's approach to his inheritance would reflect the values he had tried to instill in them throughout their lives. He had always believed that financial resources should be used to support family members' genuine needs and worthwhile goals, not to fund lifestyle upgrades or status symbols that didn't contribute to their long-term well-being or personal growth. More fundamentally, he had begun to worry about whether his family members would use his inheritance as an excuse to avoid addressing their own financial responsibilities and life choices. He could see that Ryan and Ashley had developed spending habits that exceeded their substantial income, financing their lifestyle through debt and future expectations, rather than living within their current means. He worried that a significant inheritance would enable them to continue avoiding the kind of financial discipline and personal reflection that might lead to more sustainable and fulfilling life choices. These concerns had been weighing on his mind for months when the events of the past few weeks brought everything into sharp focus and forced him to make decisions about his estate that he had been postponing. Looking back now, I can see that my family's behavior during Grandpa Joe's recent health crisis revealed everything he needed to know about their priorities and values, setting in motion the chain of events that would ultimately give me the power to hold them accountable for their choices in ways none of us could have anticipated. The differences between Ryan and me hadn't always felt like weapons, but somewhere in our 20s, they transformed into ammunition that could be deployed whenever family dynamics needed adjustment. Ryan had perfected the art of using his achievements as a shield against criticism and a sword against anyone who dared question the family's established hierarchy. His transition from college football hero to business success story had been seamless, each milestone celebrated with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for Olympic victories or Nobel Prize announcements. After graduating from Arizona State with a degree in business administration and a minor in what seemed to be natural charisma, Ryan had slipped into our father's plumbing supply company like a key finding its lock. Within 2 years, he had expanded their client base by 30%, negotiated better contracts with 3 major suppliers, and convinced Dad to open a second location in Tucson that was already exceeding projected revenues. By 25, he was earning more money than most people twice his age, driving a BMW lease that he upgraded every 18 months, and talking casually about investment portfolios and retirement planning as if financial success was as inevitable as sunrise. Ashley had been the perfect complement to Ryan's trajectory, bringing her own professional accomplishments and social connections that elevated the entire family's status in their Scottsdale social circles. She had graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in marketing, and quickly established herself as one of the most successful residential real estate agents in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Her specialty was luxury properties in Paradise Valley and Scottsdale, and she had developed a reputation for representing both buyers and sellers in transactions that regularly exceeded the $1 million mark. Together, Ryan and Ashley had created what appeared to be the perfect modern American success story. They lived in a neighborhood where the average home price exceeded $600,000, belonged to a country club that required both significant initiation fees and ongoing monthly dues that exceeded my rent, and maintained social calendars that included charity galas, business networking events, and weekend getaways to locations that required first-class airline tickets or private vehicle transportation. Their children, Madison and Connor, were enrolled in Phoenix Country Day School, a private institution that charged annual tuition comparable to many college programs. Their extracurricular activities included tennis lessons, piano instruction, swimming coaching, and summer camps that cost more per week than many families spent on groceries per month. Madison was already showing promise as an equestrian, with riding lessons and competition fees that required significant financial investment. Connor played travel baseball, which involved tournament entry fees, specialized equipment, and frequent trips to competitions throughout the Southwest. Every family gathering became an opportunity for Ryan and Ashley to share updates about their latest achievements, acquisitions, and adventures. They would arrive at my parents' house or wherever we were meeting with photo albums full of vacation pictures from Cabo San Lucas or Aspen, stories about clients they had impressed or business deals they had closed, and casual mentions of purchases or experiences that cost more than I earned in several months. My parents absorbed these updates with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching your investments pay dividends. They would ask detailed questions about Ryan's business strategies, seek Ashley's advice about real estate investments they were considering, and beam with obvious pride as they shared their sons' and daughter-in-law's accomplishments with friends and extended family members. The contrast with their approach to my career updates couldn't have been more stark. When conversation turned to my work with Child Protective Services, the enthusiasm in the room would deflate like a balloon losing helium. My mother would smile politely and ask general questions about whether I was enjoying my job, as if social work was a hobby I had chosen for personal fulfillment rather than a profession I had trained for and committed to. My father would nod thoughtfully and then quickly redirect attention to more substantial topics, apparently unable to find connections between my work with vulnerable families and anything that mattered to his understanding of success and achievement. The financial disparities between our lifestyles became more pronounced each year, creating an undercurrent of tension that no one acknowledged directly, but everyone seemed to understand. Ryan and Ashley's casual mentions of expensive purchases, luxury experiences, and financial investments served as constant reminders that my choices had led me to a fundamentally different economic reality. They never made these comparisons explicitly, but the implication was clear. Success meant having options, resources, and the kind of financial flexibility that allowed you to make choices based on preference rather than necessity. I had tried various approaches to addressing these dynamics over the years, with limited success. During my mid-20s, I had attempted to match their enthusiasm for sharing professional updates, describing cases I was working on, and families. I was helping with the same detailed excitement they brought to their business stories. But my accounts of helping reunite children with parents who had completed addiction treatment programs, or connecting elderly adults with resources that allowed them to age safely in their own homes, didn't generate the same level of engagement or follow-up questions. For a brief period, I had tried adopting their casual approach to discussing money, mentioning my student loan payments or apartment rent in the same offhand way they talked about their mortgage or vacation expenses. But these references seemed to make everyone uncomfortable, as if acknowledging financial limitations was somehow inappropriate or depressing in the context of family celebrations. Eventually, I had settled into a pattern of deflecting attention from my professional and financial circumstances by asking questions about other people's lives and experiences. This strategy worked reasonably well for maintaining family harmony, but it reinforced my position as someone whose own achievements weren't worth discussing in detail. I became the family member who was always interested in hearing about everyone else's successes but never had much to contribute about her own life. The only person who seemed to recognize this dynamic and actively work to counteract it was Grandpa Joe. During our Sunday visits, he would ask specific questions about my work that demonstrated genuine interest and understanding. He wanted to know about the training I had received, the legal frameworks that governed my investigations, and the emotional strategies I used to maintain professional boundaries while still connecting with families in crisis situations. More importantly, He would ask about the outcomes of cases I had mentioned in previous conversations, following up on families I had worked with months earlier, and celebrating successes that no one else in our family had even bothered to learn about. When I told him about helping a teenage mother access educational support that allowed her to graduate from high school while caring for her infant, he would remember her name and ask about her progress weeks later. When I described working with grandparents who had become primary caregivers for their grandchildren due to their adult children's substance abuse problems, he would want to know what resources were available and how I helped them navigate legal and financial challenges. These conversations provided me with something I didn't realize I had been missing from other family interactions: the experience of having someone treat my work as important and meaningful, rather than as a phase I was going through or a lifestyle choice that didn't require serious discussion. Grandpa Joe's questions helped me articulate aspects of my job that I rarely had opportunities to explain, and his responses demonstrated that he understood the complexity and significance of what I was trying to accomplish professionally. During one particularly memorable Sunday visit about 6 months ago, Grandpa Joe had asked me whether I felt supported by our family in my career choices. The question had caught me off guard, because it was the first time anyone had directly acknowledged that there might be disparities in how different family members' professional lives were discussed and celebrated. I had fumbled through an answer about understanding that Ryan's business success was more relatable to our parents because they were also business owners, and that social work was harder for people to understand if they hadn't been exposed to it professionally. Grandpa Joe had listened to my diplomatic response and then offered his own observations about our family dynamics with the kind of directness that only comes from having lived long enough to have earned the right to speak uncomfortable truths. He told me that he had noticed how conversation patterns shifted when people discussed my work compared to Ryan's achievements, and that he worried about whether I was getting the encouragement and recognition I deserved for choosing a profession that required personal courage and emotional resilience. He had also shared his concerns about what he saw as Ryan and Ashley's increasing focus on material success and social status, wondering whether they understood that professional achievement and financial security were tools for living meaningful lives rather than ends in themselves. He worried that their lifestyle choices were becoming driven by external validation and competitive comparison rather than personal values and authentic priorities. These observations had resonated with me more deeply than I had expected, partly because they validated feelings I had been having but hadn't known how to articulate, and partly because they came from someone whose judgment I trusted and whose life experience gave him perspective that I lacked. Grandpa Joe had lived through decades of watching people navigate career choices, financial pressures, and family relationships, and his insights helped me understand that the dynamics I was experiencing weren't just personal sensitivities, but genuine disparities in how different types of success were valued and supported within our family structure. Our conversation that day had also touched on his growing concerns about how our family approached money and financial planning. He mentioned noticing that Ryan and Ashley seemed to make spending decisions based on future expectations rather than current resources, financing lifestyle choices through debt and anticipated inheritances rather than living within their existing means. He worried that this approach to money management reflected broader issues with impulse control and long-term thinking that could create problems for them and their children if their financial circumstances changed unexpectedly. More troubling to him were comments he had overheard about his own finances and the assumptions family members seemed to be making about his estate and their eventual inheritances. During recent visits, both my parents and Ryan had made references to financial changes that were coming after Grandpa Joe was no longer around, as if his death was primarily significant as an economic event that would improve their financial flexibility and options. He had also become aware that family members were discussing his care costs and expressing resentment about the monthly fees at Sunrise Manor, apparently viewing his decision to remain in a facility that provided quality care and social engagement as unnecessarily expensive rather than as a reasonable choice for maintaining his health and well-being during his final years. These conversations had made him question whether his family understood that his money was still his to spend on his own care and preferences, or whether they had begun thinking of his assets as family resources that were being diminished by his personal choices. Part 3. The cracks begin to show. The first major crack in our family's carefully maintained facade appeared during Easter dinner this past spring, though at the time I didn't recognize it as the beginning of everything. That would follow. We were gathered at Ryan and Ashley's house, as had become our tradition for most major holidays, sitting around their formal dining room table that could accommodate 12 people comfortably and probably cost more than my car. The conversation had followed its usual patterns, with updates about business successes, real estate achievements, and the children's academic and extracurricular accomplishments. Madison had just finished telling us about winning second place in a regional equestrian competition, an achievement that had required months of preparation, specialized coaching, and equipment investments that exceeded many people's annual vacation budgets. Connor had shared news about being selected for an elite travel baseball team that would compete in tournaments throughout Arizona, California, and Nevada during the summer months. Ryan had described closing a particularly large contract with a new commercial client, while Ashley had detailed her involvement in selling a $3 million estate in Paradise Valley that had generated a commission larger than my annual salary. The conversation eventually turned to vacation planning, with Ryan and Ashley describing their intentions to spend 2 weeks in Europe during the summer, visiting London, Paris, and Rome, with itineraries that included private tours, first-class accommodations, and dining experiences at restaurants that required reservations made months in advance. Madison and Connor would attend premium summer camps during their parents' absence, programs that combined traditional camp activities with specialized instruction in horseback riding, tennis, and other pursuits that aligned with their developing interests and talents. My parents shared their own travel plans, describing a cruise through the Mediterranean that they had been planning for months and had booked through a travel agent who specialized in luxury experiences for retirees. The cruise would last 3 weeks and include guided tours of historical sites, cultural experiences, and accommodations that far exceeded anything they had enjoyed during their working years when vacation budgets were constrained by business obligations and financial limitations. When the conversation eventually included me, I mentioned that I was planning to take a long weekend to visit some college friends in Colorado, a modest trip that would involve driving rather than flying and staying in budget accommodations rather than luxury hotels. The response to my vacation plans was polite, but noticeably less enthusiastic than the reactions to everyone else's travel descriptions, reinforcing the sense that my lifestyle choices were viewed as temporary limitations, rather than conscious decisions about how I wanted to spend my time and resources. But the moment that revealed the deeper tensions within our family dynamics came when someone asked about Grandpa Joe's Easter plans. I had assumed that he would be joining us for dinner, as he had for most holidays during the years before he moved to Sunrise Manor. When I asked what time we should pick him up, the silence that followed my question was both immediate and uncomfortable. Ashley was the first to respond, explaining in her carefully modulated voice that they had decided to keep Easter dinner intimate this year, limiting attendance to immediate family members only. She mentioned concerns about Grandpa Joe's mobility, limitations, and the potential challenges of accommodating his walker and other accessibility needs in their home. She also referenced his energy levels and suggested that a long family gathering might be too taxing for someone his age. My mother quickly supported Ashley's explanation, adding that they had planned to visit Grandpa Joe the following day with Easter leftovers and photo albums from our dinner celebration. She emphasized that this arrangement would allow him to enjoy family time without the stress of transportation and extended social interaction that might be overwhelming given his recent health challenges. Ryan contributed his own rationale, noting that their house wasn't ideally configured for elderly guests and that Grandpa Joe would probably be more comfortable in his familiar surroundings at Sunrise Manor. He suggested that splitting the celebration, into two parts would actually provide more quality time with Grandpa Joe, because they could focus entirely on him during their visit, rather than managing the logistics of including him in a larger family gathering. The explanations were reasonable on their surface, but something about the coordinated nature of their responses suggested that this decision had been discussed and agreed upon without any input from me, or more significantly, without consulting Grandpa Joe about his preferences. I asked whether anyone had talked with him about these arrangements, and the brief hesitation before my mother's response confirmed my suspicions that the decision had been made unilaterally. When I suggested that we could easily modify our celebration to accommodate Grandpa Joe's needs, perhaps by shortening the overall event or arranging transportation that would be more comfortable for him, the resistance to this idea was immediate and unanimous. Ashley mentioned the meal planning she had already completed and the timing she had coordinated with the catering staff she had hired to assist with food preparation. Ryan noted the other commitments they had later in the day that would make schedule changes difficult to manage. My parents expressed concerns about disrupting arrangements that had already been finalized and suggested that changing plans at the last minute might create unnecessary stress for everyone involved. They emphasized their intention to have a meaningful visit with Grandpa Joe the following day and their belief that this approach would be better for his health and comfort. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I remained troubled by what had just occurred. The ease with which my family had excluded Grandpa Joe from our Easter celebration, and their confidence that this decision was appropriate and considerate, revealed assumptions about aging, family obligations, and social inclusion that I found deeply problematic. More concerning was their apparent belief that they could make decisions about his social participation without consulting him or considering his own preferences about how he wanted to spend important holidays. After dinner, while helping clear dishes in the kitchen, I attempted to raise the topic again with Ashley, thinking that a private conversation might allow for more honest discussion about the reasoning behind excluding Grandpa Joe. Her response was more direct than her earlier explanations had been, revealing attitudes that she had been careful not to express in front of the entire family. Ashley told me that including elderly family members in holiday celebrations required accommodations and considerations that fundamentally changed the nature of the events. She mentioned concerns about conversation topics that might be appropriate. For children, when elderly relatives were present, the challenges of managing different dietary needs and medication schedules, and the overall energy levels that were possible when events needed to be planned around the limitations of older participants. She also expressed frustration about what she saw as the burden of organizing family gatherings that needed to accommodate multiple generations with different needs and preferences. She felt that her role as hostess required her to manage logistics that became exponentially more complicated when elderly family members were included, and she questioned whether the benefits of inclusion justified the additional planning and preparation required. Most troubling were her comments about the impact on Madison and Connor of spending extended time in the presence of aging relatives. She worried that exposure to the physical limitations and health challenges that came with advanced age might be disturbing or confusing for children who were still developing their understanding of life stages and mortality. She preferred to control their interactions with Grandpa Joe through structured visits that could be managed more carefully than large family gatherings. These revelations helped me understand that the decision to exclude Grandpa Joe from Easter dinner wasn't an isolated choice based on practical considerations, but rather reflected deeper attitudes about aging, family responsibility, and social inclusion that would continue to influence future decisions about his participation in family events. Ashley's comments also suggested that she viewed accommodating elderly family members as burdensome, rather than as an opportunity to model compassion and intergenerational connection for her children. The following day, I drove to Sunrise Manor to visit Grandpa Joe and deliver the Easter leftovers that my family had promised to bring. I found him in his apartment, dressed in his best shirt and tie, clearly having prepared for a family visit that would be much shorter and less festive than the celebration he had been excluded from the previous day. His disappointment was obvious. Though he tried to maintain his characteristic positive attitude as I shared details about our Easter dinner and presented him with the carefully packaged leftovers that Ashley had prepared. He asked thoughtful questions about Madison and Connor's activities, Ryan's business developments, and my parents' travel plans, demonstrating the kind of genuine interest in family members' lives that had been notably absent from our dinner conversation when discussing his own circumstances. But as our visit continued, Grandpa Joe began sharing his own perspectives on what had happened, revealing that he understood the dynamics behind his exclusion more clearly than my family had realized. He told me that he had been expecting to be included in Easter dinner until my mother had called 3 days earlier to explain the new arrangements, and that the explanations she had provided were different from the rationales I had heard the previous day. According to Grandpa Joe, my mother had focused primarily on his health limitations and the challenges of transportation, suggesting that attending family gatherings was becoming too difficult for him to manage comfortably. She had emphasized their concern for his well-being and their desire to protect him from situations that might be physically or emotionally taxing, given his age and recent health challenges. He had accepted these explanations at the time, partly because he wanted to avoid creating conflicts within the family, and partly because he recognized that his mobility and energy levels weren't what they had been in previous years. But his conversation with me revealed that he had also detected underlying attitudes and assumptions that concerned him beyond the immediate question of holiday participation. Grandpa Joe told me that he had been noticing changes in how family members interacted with him during their visits, changes that suggested they were beginning to view him primarily through the lens of his limitations, rather than as a complete person with ongoing interests, opinions, and capabilities. Conversations had become more focused on his physical health and care needs, with less attention to his thoughts about current events, family developments, or the social dynamics he observed at Sunrise Manor. He had also become aware that family members were discussing his finances and care costs among themselves, making assumptions about his resources and expressing opinions about his spending choices without consulting him directly. These conversations had made him question whether his family understood that his money remained his to allocate according to his own priorities and preferences, or whether they had begun thinking of his assets as family resources that should be managed according to their collective financial planning needs. Most significantly, Grandpa Joe shared his growing concerns about what would happen to family relationships and dynamics after he was no longer around to serve as a connecting point for different generations and personalities. He worried that the practical considerations that were increasingly influencing decisions about his participation in family events reflected deeper issues with empathy, inclusivity, and intergenerational responsibility that would continue to affect how family members treated each other in various circumstances. Our conversation that Easter Sunday marked a turning point in my understanding of the forces that were reshaping our family dynamics. For the first time, I began to see clearly how financial considerations, social status concerns, and convenience factors were taking precedence over relationship maintenance and inclusive family values. I also began to understand that Grandpa Joe was not just passively experiencing these changes, but was actively observing and evaluating how his family's priorities and values were evolving in ways that would have long-term consequences for all of us. Part 4. The Health Crisis That Changed Everything. 3 months after Easter, on a scorching July afternoon when Phoenix temperatures were hovering around 115 degrees, I received the phone call that would set everything in motion. I was at my office, reviewing case files and preparing for a court hearing scheduled for the following week, when my cell phone rang with a number I didn't immediately recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to Sandra Martinez, the head nurse at Sunrise Manor, and her tone carried the kind of careful urgency that healthcare professionals use when delivering serious news to family members. Grandpa Joe had suffered what appeared to be a stroke during his afternoon rest period. Another resident had found him in his apartment, conscious but unable to speak clearly and experiencing weakness on his left side. The facility's medical staff had immediately called for an ambulance, and he was being transported to Phoenix Baptist Medical Center for emergency evaluation and treatment. Sandra emphasized that he was stable and alert, but that the next several hours would be critical for determining the extent of the neurological damage and the most appropriate treatment options. My first reaction was panic, followed immediately by the practical awareness that I needed to contact the rest of my family and coordinate our response to this crisis. I grabbed my purse and keys, told my supervisor that I had a family emergency and would be unreachable for the rest of the day, and headed for the hospital while simultaneously trying to reach my parents, Ryan and Ashley, by phone. The drive to Phoenix Baptist felt endless, even though traffic was relatively light for a weekday afternoon. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios and best-case possibilities, trying to prepare myself for whatever I might find when I reached the emergency department. I kept thinking about our conversation the previous Sunday, when Grandpa Joe had seemed particularly energetic and engaged, sharing stories about a new resident at Sunrise Manor who had been a jazz musician and was organizing informal concerts for other residents who missed having live music in their lives. I reached the hospital emergency department about 45 minutes after receiving Sandra's call and immediately approached the registration desk to inquire about Grandpa Joe's status and location. The process of obtaining information seemed to take forever, involving multiple phone calls between different departments and requests for identification and documentation of my relationship to the patient. Eventually, a nurse directed me to a family consultation room where I could wait for updates from the medical team that was evaluating his condition. The consultation room was sterile and uncomfortable, with fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unwelcoming. I sat in one of the vinyl chairs and tried to process what was happening while monitoring my phone for responses from other family members. My mother called back first, her voice tight with anxiety, as she asked for details about Grandpa Joe's condition and the hospital's initial assessment. She and my father were at their business, dealing with a plumbing emergency at a commercial client's facility, but they would leave immediately and drive directly to the hospital. Ryan's response came via text message, explaining that he was in meetings with potential clients but would try to get to the hospital as soon as his schedule permitted. Ashley sent a brief message asking for updates and noting that she was managing the children's pickup from summer camp and other afternoon logistics that couldn't be immediately rearranged. Both of their messages conveyed concern and intention to be supportive, but also suggested that the stroke emergency was competing with other priorities that couldn't be easily dismissed or postponed. I spent the next 2 hours alone in that consultation room, occasionally receiving brief updates from nursing staff about the various tests and evaluations that were being conducted. The medical team was performing CT scans to assess the extent of brain damage, blood work to identify potential underlying causes or complications, and neurological assessments to determine which functions had been affected and which remained intact. Each update was reassuring in that it confirmed Grandpa Joe was stable and conscious, but also concerning because it indicated that the medical evaluation was complex and ongoing. My parents arrived at the hospital around 5 o'clock, looking shaken and exhausted from their rushed drive across the city in heavy traffic. They had stopped at home to change clothes and gather some personal items they thought might be needed for an extended hospital stay, and they brought updates from their brief phone conversation with Sandra Martinez about the circumstances surrounding Grandpa Joe's stroke and the facility's response to the emergency. According to Sandra, Grandpa Joe had been following his normal afternoon routine, returning to his apartment after lunch for the rest period that had become part of his daily schedule since moving to Sunrise Manor. When he failed to appear for the scheduled 3:30 social hour in the community room, one of the other residents had knocked on his door to check on him. Finding the door unlocked, she had entered to discover Grandpa Joe sitting in his recliner, conscious but obviously distressed and unable to communicate clearly. The facility's nursing staff had responded immediately, conducting initial assessments and determining that his symptoms were consistent with stroke. Their protocol required immediate emergency medical intervention, so they had called for ambulance transportation while simultaneously contacting family members and gathering his medical records for transfer to the hospital. Sandra had emphasized that their staff had followed appropriate procedures and that the timing between discovering the stroke and initiating emergency care had been optimal for maximizing treatment options. My parents and I were finally able to see Grandpa Joe around 6:30, after the medical team had completed their initial evaluations and determined that he was stable enough for family visits. He was in the neurological intensive care unit, connected to monitoring equipment that tracked his heart rate, blood pressure, and other vital signs. But he was alert and responsive when we entered his room. The stroke had affected his speech and left-side mobility, but his cognitive functions appeared largely intact. He recognized us immediately and seemed relieved to see familiar faces after hours of medical procedures and evaluations conducted by strangers. His attempts to communicate were frustrated by the speech difficulties, but he was able to squeeze our hands and nod or shake his head in response to direct questions about his comfort and needs. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the neurologist overseeing his care, met with us in his room to explain the medical findings and discuss treatment options and prognosis. The stroke had been caused by a blood clot that had blocked circulation to a specific area of his brain, resulting in damage to regions that controlled speech and left-side motor functions. The good news was that the stroke appeared to be relatively localized, meaning that many of his cognitive abilities and personality characteristics were likely to remain unchanged. The treatment plan would involve medications to prevent additional clots, physical therapy to help restore mobility and strength, and speech therapy to address communication difficulties. Dr. Hernandez emphasized that recovery from stroke was often a gradual process that could continue for months or even years, and that the extent of his eventual recovery would depend on various factors including his overall health, his commitment to rehabilitation, and the support system available to assist with his recovery process. She also discussed the practical implications of his current condition for his living situation and care needs. Depending on his progress during the next several days, he might be able to return to Sunrise Manor with additional support services, or he might need to transition to a facility that provided more intensive medical care and rehabilitation services. These decisions would be made based on his response to initial treatment and the recommendations of the rehabilitation team that would be working with him during his hospital stay. My parents asked detailed questions about the medical aspects of his condition, the timeline for recovery, and the various care options that might be appropriate as he progressed through different stages of rehabilitation. They seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the decisions that would need to be made and the number of variables that would influence his recovery process. But they were clearly committed to ensuring that he received appropriate care and support. Ryan arrived at the hospital around 8 o'clock, apologizing for his delayed response and explaining that he had needed to complete client meetings that couldn't be rescheduled without significant professional consequences. He spent about 30 minutes with Grandpa Joe, asking questions about his comfort and needs, and receiving updates from the nursing staff about his condition and the care he was receiving. However, I noticed that Ryan seemed uncomfortable with the hospital environment and the visual reminders of Grandpa Joe's physical vulnerability. His conversation focused primarily on logistical questions about treatment timelines and discharge planning, rather than on emotional support or relationship maintenance. He left after confirming that Grandpa Joe was stable and that immediate crisis had passed, promising to return the following day when he could arrange more flexibility in his work schedule. Ashley never came to the hospital that evening, sending messages through Ryan about her concern and support, but explaining that she needed to manage the children's evening routines and couldn't arrange childcare on such short notice. Her absence was notable, particularly since Madison and Connor were old enough to be left alone for a few hours, or could have been brought to the hospital for a brief visit with their great-grandfather. I ended up staying at the hospital until nearly midnight, long after my parents had returned home and Ryan had left for his own family obligations. I wanted to be present in case Grandpa Joe needed anything during the night, and I felt compelled to compensate for the absence of other family members who might have provided additional emotional support during this frightening and disorienting experience. During the quiet hours when Grandpa Joe was sleeping, I had time to reflect on my family's response to this crisis and what it revealed about their priorities and values. While everyone had expressed appropriate concern and taken steps to address the immediate emergency, their actions also demonstrated how quickly practical considerations and competing obligations took precedence over relationship maintenance and emotional support. More troubling was the underlying assumption that seemed to guide their decision-making, that my schedule and commitments were more flexible than theirs, and therefore I was the logical choice to provide extended support and presence during Grandpa's hospitalization. This assumption reflected the same dynamics that had shaped our family interactions for years, positioning me as the family member whose professional and personal obligations were less important than everyone else's responsibilities. Over the following week, as Grandpa Joe began his recovery process, and we navigated the complex decisions about his ongoing care needs, these patterns became even more pronounced. I found myself serving as the primary liaison with his medical team, attending rehabilitation sessions, and managing communications with Sunrise Manor about potential modifications to his living arrangements. Meanwhile, my family members maintained their regular schedules and commitments, checking in periodically about his progress, but leaving the daily management of his care to me and the medical professionals. Their approach wasn't deliberately neglectful, but it reflected a fundamental assumption that someone else would handle the demanding aspects of crisis management, while they continued focusing on their own priorities and obligations. This division of labor might have been sustainable if it had been explicitly discussed and agreed upon, but instead it evolved naturally based on everyone's assumptions about whose time and energy were most available and appropriate for managing family emergencies. The result was that I became the de facto coordinator of Grandpa Joe's care, while other family members remained involved at a distance that allowed them to maintain their existing routines and commitments. Next, Part 5. The Systematic Abandonment. The 3 weeks following Grandpa Joe's stroke revealed the true nature of my family's commitment to his well-being in ways that were both gradual and devastating. What began as understandable initial responses to a medical emergency evolved into patterns of systematic abandonment that left me questioning everything I had believed about our family's values and priorities. During Grandpa Joe's first week in the hospital, while he was still in the neurological intensive care unit and his condition remained uncertain, my family members maintained relatively consistent involvement in his care. My parents visited daily, usually during afternoon hours when their business obligations were lighter. Ryan stopped by every other day, often bringing work documents that he reviewed while sitting in Grandpa Joe's room, combining family responsibilities with professional productivity. Ashley visited twice during that first week, bringing flowers and magazines, staying for brief periods before returning to manage household and childcare responsibilities. These initial visits seemed to indicate that everyone understood the seriousness of Grandpa Joe's condition and was committed to providing appropriate support during his recovery. The conversations during family visits were encouraging and forward-looking, focusing on his progress with physical therapy, improvements in his speech clarity, and plans for his eventual return to independent living at Sunrise Manor. However, as Grandpa Joe's condition stabilized and the immediate crisis atmosphere diminished, the frequency and duration of family visits began to decline in ways that revealed their true attitudes toward ongoing care responsibilities. By the second week of his hospitalization, my parents' daily visits had become every other day check-ins that lasted 30 to 40 minutes. Ryan's visits decreased to twice weekly, and Ashley stopped coming altogether, explaining that the children needed consistency in their summer routines and that hospital environments were too stressful for her to manage while maintaining her emotional stability. More concerning than the declining visit frequency were the changes in conversation topics and engagement levels during the visits that did occur. Instead of focusing on Grandpa Joe's experiences, feelings, and needs during this difficult transition, family conversations increasingly centered on logistical planning and financial considerations related to his care. My parents began asking detailed questions about the costs of his extended hospitalization, whether his Medicare coverage would be sufficient to cover rehabilitation services, and what his ongoing care expenses might be if he required more intensive support than Sunrise Manor could provide. Ryan inquired about his insurance policies, the accessibility of his financial accounts, and whether someone should begin organizing his important documents in case additional medical decisions needed to be made. These practical concerns were certainly legitimate, but the timing and context of these discussions were troubling. Rather than waiting until Grandpa Joe had achieved some stability in his recovery process or conducting these conversations separately from his bedside visits, my family seemed to view his hospitalization as an opportunity to address financial and legal matters that they had been curious about but hadn't previously felt comfortable exploring. Even more disturbing were comments that suggested they were already planning for care scenarios that assumed significant limitations in his eventual recovery. During one visit, my mother mentioned researching nursing facilities that specialized in long-term care for stroke patients, explaining that she wanted to be prepared if Grandpa Joe couldn't return to the independent living environment at Sunrise Manor. Ryan added that they should probably consider selling his house sooner rather than later, since property values in his neighborhood were strong, and they didn't want to miss an optimal market opportunity. These planning discussions occurred in Grandpa Joe's presence, apparently without consideration of how it might feel to hear family members discussing your future, as if your own preferences and recovery potential were irrelevant factors in their decision-making process. When I suggested that these conversations might be premature and that we should focus on supporting his current recovery efforts rather than planning for worst-case scenarios, my family members seemed genuinely surprised by my objection. My mother explained that they were simply being responsible and proactive about potential challenges that might arise, and that planning ahead was the caring thing to do rather than waiting until crisis situations forced hasty decisions. Ryan added that financial and legal planning were complex processes that required significant lead time, and that addressing these issues while Grandpa Joe was still able to participate in decision-making was more respectful than handling everything after his condition deteriorated further. Their rationales were reasonable on the surface, but they reflected assumptions about Grandpa Joe's recovery prospects that seemed inconsistent with the medical information we were receiving from his rehabilitation team. His physical therapist had described his progress as encouraging, noting improvements in his mobility and strength that suggested potential for significant recovery with continued effort and support. His speech therapist was optimistic about his communication abilities, explaining that the type of language processing difficulties he was experiencing often responded well to intensive therapy over time. Yet my family's planning discussions seemed to ignore these positive indicators in favor of focusing on limitations and worst-case scenarios that would justify decisions they appeared to have already made about his future care arrangements. The disconnect between medical optimism and family pessimism suggested that factors other than his actual recovery potential were influencing their decision-making process. By the third week of Grandpa Joe's hospitalization, the patterns of family involvement had shifted dramatically. My parents' visits had dwindled to twice-weekly obligations that lasted barely 20 minutes, during which they would ask perfunctory questions about his medical progress, before launching into detailed discussions about the practical arrangements they were making for his future care. These conversations invariably focused on cost considerations, insurance limitations, and the various facilities they had toured that might be more appropriate for someone with his level of ongoing care needs. Ryan's hospital visits had become weekly events that he clearly viewed as burdensome interruptions to his business schedule. He would arrive with his phone in hand, checking emails and text messages throughout his brief stays, and his conversations with Grandpa Joe were stilted and uncomfortable. Rather than engaging with the person his grandfather was becoming as he adapted to his new limitations, Ryan seemed to relate to him primarily as a logistical problem that needed to be solved efficiently and economically. Ashley had disappeared entirely from Grandpa Joe's support system, having determined that hospital visits were too emotionally taxing for her to manage while maintaining her own psychological well-being and managing her children's summer activities. Her absence was particularly notable because she had previously positioned herself as someone who cared deeply about family relationships and took pride in her role as the organizing force behind family gatherings and celebrations. The most revealing aspect of my family's evolving response to Grandpa Joe's situation was how quickly they had transferred responsibility for his daily care coordination to me. Without any explicit discussion or agreement, I had become the primary point of contact for his medical team, the person who attended his therapy sessions and rehabilitation planning meetings, and the family member who made decisions about his immediate care needs and comfort requirements. This transition had occurred so gradually that I hadn't initially recognized it as a deliberate strategy rather than a natural response to circumstances. But as the weeks progressed, it became clear that my family members had made conscious decisions to limit their involvement to high-level planning discussions while leaving the demanding emotional and logistical work of daily care management to me. The rationale for this division of labor was never explicitly stated, but the underlying assumptions were obvious. My work schedule was viewed as more flexible than Ryan's business commitments or my parents' professional obligations. My emotional capacity for dealing with medical complexity and family stress was assumed to be greater than Ashley's ability to manage such situations. My financial resources were seen as less constrained than everyone else's, meaning I could absorb the costs of frequent hospital visits, parking fees, and the various expenses associated with extended family crisis management. Most significantly, my personal life was perceived as less demanding and important than the family and professional responsibilities that occupied other family members' time and attention. The fact that I was single and childless was interpreted as meaning that I had unlimited availability for crisis management, while the fact that my career involved working with families in difficult situations was seen as evidence that I was naturally suited for coordinating complex care arrangements. These assumptions might have been reasonable if they had been discussed openly, and I had agreed to accept primary responsibility for Grandpa Joe's care coordination. But instead, they had evolved organically based on everyone's convenience and comfort levels, without consideration of my own needs, limitations, or preferences in the situation. The emotional toll of serving as Grandpa Joe's primary advocate and support person while watching my family members gradually distance themselves from his care was significant and multifaceted. On one level, I was dealing with the normal stress and sadness that comes with watching a beloved family member navigate serious health challenges and adjust to significant life changes. On another level, I was processing the disappointment and anger that came with recognizing how little support my family was providing during this difficult period. But the most challenging aspect of the situation was the growing awareness that my family's response to Grandpa Joe's stroke was revealing fundamental truths about their values and priorities that I had been avoiding or minimizing for years. Their quick retreat from active involvement in his care, their focus on financial and logistical planning rather than emotional support, and their assumptions about my unlimited availability for crisis management all reflected patterns of behavior that extended far beyond this specific situation. During one particularly difficult evening, as I sat beside Grandpa Joe's hospital bed while he struggled through a speech therapy session, I found myself confronting the reality that my family's treatment of him was not fundamentally different from their treatment of me throughout my adult life. In both cases, they had created narratives that justified minimal investment in relationships that didn't provide obvious returns or enhance their own comfort and convenience. Just as they had dismissed my career choices as impractical and my lifestyle preferences as temporary phases that didn't warrant serious consideration, they were now treating Grandpa Joe's health challenges as inconveniences that could be managed through appropriate delegation and financial planning, rather than personal engagement and emotional support. The parallel between my own experiences and Grandpa Joe's situation helped me understand that the problems I was witnessing weren't isolated responses to medical crisis, but rather consistent patterns of behavior that reflected my family's approach to relationships, responsibility, and care. They were comfortable providing financial support and logistical assistance when such contributions could be made without significant personal cost or inconvenience. But they were unwilling to invest the time, energy, and emotional resources required for meaningful relationship maintenance during difficult periods. This recognition was both painful and clarifying. It explained why I had often felt isolated and undervalued within my family structure, and it predicted how they would likely respond to future challenges and crises that required sustained personal investment rather than financial contributions or brief expressions of concern. More importantly, it helped me understand that the responsibility I was carrying for Grandpa Joe's care wasn't just about managing his current medical needs, but about ensuring that at least one family member was committed to maintaining the kind of relationship with him that recognized his worth and dignity as a person, rather than viewing him primarily as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. The 4th week of Grandpa Joe's hospitalization brought news that his recovery had progressed sufficiently for him to be discharged to a rehabilitation facility where he could continue his physical and speech therapy while living in a more home-like environment. This development should have been cause for celebration, representing significant progress from the frightening uncertainty of his first days after the stroke. Instead, the discharge planning process became another opportunity for my family to demonstrate their priorities and reveal their assumptions about care responsibilities. The social worker assigned to coordinate his transition from hospital to rehabilitation facility scheduled a family meeting to discuss his needs, preferences, and the various options available for his continued care. I had assumed that this meeting would include all family members who had been involved in his care decisions, but when I arrived at the designated conference room, I discovered that I was the only family representative present. My parents had sent regrets, explaining that they had a critical business meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. Ryan was dealing with a client emergency that required his immediate attention. Ashley was managing a real estate closing that had been scheduled months in advance. The social worker, Patricia Williams, seemed surprised by the absence of other family members, particularly since the decisions being made would affect Grandpa Joe's living situation and care arrangements for the foreseeable future. She explained, that family input was crucial for ensuring that the rehabilitation facility and services selected would be appropriate for his specific needs and consistent with his personal preferences and long-term goals. When I explained that I was prepared to represent the family's interests and make decisions on their behalf, Patricia asked whether I had legal authority to make such decisions or whether other family members needed to be consulted before finalizing arrangements. This question forced me to confront the reality that while I had been functioning as Grandpa Joe's primary advocate and care coordinator, I didn't actually have any formal authority to make decisions about his care without input from other family members. The meeting proceeded with Patricia outlining various rehabilitation facilities that could accommodate Grandpa Joe's needs, discussing the different levels of care and support available, and explaining the process for transitioning from hospital-based care to community-based rehabilitation services. Throughout this discussion, she repeatedly emphasized the importance of family involvement in supporting his recovery and maintaining his connection to the relationships and activities that had been meaningful to him before his stroke. Her comments about family support highlighted the gap between what Grandpa Joe needed for optimal recovery and what my family was prepared to provide. The rehabilitation process would be more successful if he had regular visitors who could provide encouragement and emotional support during the challenging work of relearning basic skills and adapting to his new limitations. His motivation and progress would benefit from family members who could participate in therapy sessions, practice communication exercises with him, and help him maintain connections to his interests and relationships outside the medical setting. But based on the patterns of involvement I had observed during his hospitalization, it seemed unlikely that my family members would increase their participation in his care as he moved to a rehabilitation facility. If anything, the transition away from the crisis atmosphere of the hospital setting would probably reduce their sense of urgency and obligation, leading to even less frequent visits and lower levels of personal engagement with his recovery process. After the meeting with Patricia, I spent time with Grandpa Joe discussing his preferences for rehabilitation facilities and his feelings about the transition from hospital to community-based care. These conversations were both encouraging and heartbreaking, as he expressed gratitude for the progress he had made, while also acknowledging his awareness of how little support he was receiving from most family members. Grandpa Joe told me that he understood why hospital visits had become less frequent as his condition stabilized, and that he didn't want to be a burden on family members who had their own responsibilities and obligations. But he also shared his disappointment about feeling disconnected from the people who had been central to his life before the stroke, and his concerns about what his relationships with them would look like as he continued his recovery. He mentioned specific examples of family members' changed behavior that had hurt his feelings, such as conversations that focused exclusively on his medical condition rather than his thoughts and experiences, visits that seemed rushed and obligatory rather than genuinely caring, and planning discussions that occurred as if his own preferences and goals were irrelevant to the decisions being made about his future. Most significantly, he told me that he had been thinking about the broader implications of his family's response to his health crisis and what their behavior revealed about their values and priorities. He worried that their quick retreat from active involvement in his care reflected attitudes toward aging and dependency that would affect how they treated other family members who faced similar challenges in the future. He also expressed concerns about the financial and legal aspects of his care planning, noting that family members had been asking questions about his assets and insurance coverage without consulting him about his own priorities for managing these resources. He felt that they were making assumptions about his care preferences based on cost considerations rather than quality of life factors, and that their planning discussions reflected greater concern for preserving his estate than for ensuring his comfort and well-being during his recovery. These conversations with Grandpa Joe forced me to confront the reality that his stroke had not just revealed my family's limitations as caregivers, but had also exposed deeper problems with their approach to relationships, responsibility, and care that extended far beyond the immediate medical crisis. During the 5th week following his stroke, as Grandpa Joe prepared to transfer to Sunset Rehabilitation Center, a facility that specialized in helping stroke patients regain independence and return to community living, he asked me to stay after one of our visits to discuss something important. His speech had improved significantly during his hospitalization, and while he still experienced some difficulty with complex sentences and rapid conversation, he was able to communicate clearly about topics that mattered to him. He told me that he had been thinking about his estate planning and the legal arrangements he had made for managing his finances and healthcare decisions if he became unable to advocate for himself. Before his stroke, these had seemed like abstract concerns that might become relevant at some point in the distant future, but his recent experiences had made him realize that he needed to ensure that his wishes would be respected and his resources would be managed according to his values, rather than other people's assumptions about what was best for him. Grandpa Joe explained that he had originally designated my father as his healthcare power of attorney and financial executor, assuming that his son-in-law would make decisions that reflected his preferences and priorities. But the past month had made him question whether my father understood his values well enough to represent his interests effectively, particularly if conflicts arose between his personal preferences and the family's financial or logistical convenience. He asked whether I would be willing to accept these responsibilities, acknowledging that they would involve significant time commitments and potentially difficult decisions about his care and finances. He emphasized that he wasn't asking me to make these decisions unilaterally, but rather to ensure that his own wishes were prioritized when conflicts arose between his preferences and other family members' assumptions about what was appropriate or necessary. This conversation was both an honor and a burden, representing Grandpa Joe's trust in my judgment and commitment to his well-being, but also placing me in a position that would inevitably create tensions with other family members, who had been assuming that they would have input into his care and financial decisions. I told Grandpa Joe that I was willing to accept these responsibilities, but that I wanted him to understand the potential consequences of making such changes to his legal arrangements. Other family members might interpret his decision as evidence that I was manipulating him or trying to gain control over his assets for my own benefit. They might challenge his legal capacity to make such decisions or contest the validity of any changes he made to his estate planning. Grandpa Joe acknowledged these risks, but explained that his recent experiences had convinced him that protecting his autonomy and ensuring that his values were respected was more important than avoiding family conflict. He felt that his current legal arrangements would not adequately protect his interests if he faced future health challenges, and that making changes now, while he was clearly competent to make such decisions, was the responsible thing to do. He also shared his concerns about how his family's response to his stroke had revealed their attitudes toward aging, dependency, and care that would affect not just his own future, but the experiences of other family members who might face similar challenges. He worried that their focus on financial and logistical planning, rather than emotional support and relationship maintenance, reflected values that would make aging and illness more difficult and isolating for anyone who needed care and support. The following week, Grandpa Joe met with his attorney to update his healthcare directives and financial power of attorney documents, officially designating me as his healthcare advocate and financial executor. The attorney explained the legal implications of these changes and confirmed that Grandpa Joe was fully competent to make such decisions, documenting his reasoning and ensuring that the new arrangements would be legally valid and enforceable. These changes meant that I would have legal authority to make healthcare decisions on Grandpa Joe's behalf if he became unable to advocate for himself, and that I would be responsible for managing his financial affairs and estate distribution, according to his written instructions, rather than family members' assumptions about what was appropriate. The attorney also explained that as financial executor, I would have significant discretion about the timing and manner of estate distribution, particularly if circumstances arose that suggested beneficiaries were not acting in Grandpa Joe's best interests or were pressuring him to make decisions that conflicted with his stated values and preferences. This information was both empowering and intimidating, giving me legal tools to protect Grandpa Joe's interests while also placing me in a position that would inevitably create conflicts with family members who had been expecting to have input into his care and financial decisions. As Grandpa Joe settled into his new routine at Sunset Rehabilitation Center, the patterns of family involvement that had emerged during his hospitalization continued and intensified. My parents visited once during his first week at the facility, spending about 30 minutes asking questions about his therapy schedule and the facility's policies before leaving to attend to other obligations. Ryan stopped by briefly twice during the first 2 weeks, combining these visits with other errands in the area rather than making special trips specifically to see Grandpa Joe. Ashley never visited the rehabilitation facility, explaining through Ryan that she found such environments depressing and that she preferred to maintain her emotional stability by avoiding situations that reminded her of aging and mortality. She sent cards and flowers occasionally, but made no effort to maintain personal contact with Grandpa Joe during this crucial period of his recovery. Meanwhile, I found myself visiting Sunset Rehabilitation Center 3 or 4 times per week, attending therapy sessions when possible, participating in care planning meetings, and serving as Grandpa Joe's primary source of family connection and emotional support. The staff at the facility began treating me as his primary family contact, calling me with updates and questions rather than attempting to reach other family members who had proven unreliable or unresponsive. This arrangement worked reasonably well for managing Grandpa Joe's immediate care needs, but it also reinforced the pattern of unequal responsibility distribution that had characterized my family's response to his stroke. I was providing the majority of emotional support and practical assistance, while other family members maintained their regular schedules and commitments with minimal disruption to their own lives. The inequity of this arrangement became particularly apparent when I had to take time off from work to attend important care planning meetings or accompany Grandpa Joe to medical appointments, while other family members continued their professional and personal activities without making similar accommodations for his needs. More concerning was the way this arrangement affected my own emotional and physical well-being. The combination of full-time work responsibilities, frequent visits to the rehabilitation facility, coordination with medical professionals, and management of Grandpa Joe's legal and financial affairs was exhausting and stressful in ways that I hadn't anticipated when I had agreed to accept these responsibilities. But the most difficult aspect of the situation was the growing awareness that my family members not only weren't providing adequate support for Grandpa Joe's recovery, but were actively planning for his future, as if his own preferences and goals were irrelevant to their decision-making process. Their conversations continued to focus on financial and logistical considerations, rather than his emotional needs and relationship maintenance, and they seemed to be making assumptions about his long-term care arrangements without consulting him about his own priorities and preferences. As September approached and Grandpa Joe's recovery continued to progress, the rehabilitation team began discussing discharge planning and the transition back to community living. These discussions should have been exciting opportunities to celebrate his recovery and plan for his return to the activities and relationships that had been meaningful to him before his stroke. Instead, they became sources of conflict and tension as my family members expressed opinions about his future living arrangements that seemed to prioritize their own convenience and financial considerations over his well-being and preferences. The stage was being set for confrontations that would force me to use the legal authority I had been given to protect his interests, even if doing so created permanent rifts in family relationships that had already been severely damaged by their response to his health crisis. October brought with it the kind of desert weather that makes Phoenix bearable again, with temperatures dropping into the 80s and the oppressive summer heat finally releasing its grip on the city. For most people, this seasonal transition marked a return to outdoor activities, hiking adventures, and the social gatherings that had been suspended during the brutal summer months. For me, it represented the approach of holiday season and the inevitable family obligations that would force confrontations I had been dreading since Grandpa Joe's legal documents had been signed 6 weeks earlier. Grandpa Joe had successfully completed his rehabilitation program at Sunset and had returned to Sunrise Manor with modifications to his apartment that accommodated his mobility limitations and ongoing recovery needs. His speech had improved dramatically, though he still experienced fatigue that made long conversations challenging. His left side weakness remained noticeable, but he had regained enough mobility to manage most daily activities independently, with the assistance of adaptive equipment and occasional help from facility staff. More importantly, his cognitive abilities had returned to their pre-stroke levels, allowing him to engage fully in decisions about his care and to understand the implications of the legal arrangements he had made. The attorney had conducted follow-up assessments to document his mental competency, ensuring that any challenges to his decision-making capacity would be legally baseless. The transition back to Sunrise Manor had gone smoothly from a medical and logistical perspective, but it had also revealed the extent to which my family's involvement in Grandpa Joe's life had diminished during his months of health challenges. Other residents welcomed him back with genuine enthusiasm, asking about his recovery and including him immediately in the social activities and informal gatherings that had been important to him before his stroke. In contrast, my family's response to his return was perfunctory and brief. My parents visited once during his first week back, spending about 20 minutes asking basic questions about his comfort and needs before leaving to attend to other obligations. Ryan stopped by with Ashley and the children for a visit that lasted less than an hour, during which the adults focused primarily on scheduling logistics, while Madison and Connor sat quietly, clearly uncomfortable with their great-grandfathers, visible signs of aging and health challenges. These brief visits confirmed what had become obvious during Grandpa Joe's rehabilitation period. My family members had mentally and emotionally distanced themselves from him in ways that reflected their discomfort with aging, illness, and dependency. They were prepared to fulfill minimal social obligations and provide financial support when necessary, but they were unwilling to maintain the kind of meaningful relationship that would require sustained personal engagement and emotional investment. The contrast with my own involvement in Grandpa Joe's life had become more pronounced as his care needs evolved from crisis management to ongoing support and companionship. I continued visiting him 3 times per week, not because he required constant monitoring, but because our conversations were meaningful to both of us, and because I had recognized that my presence provided him with family connection that he wasn't receiving from other sources. During these visits, Grandpa Joe had begun sharing his observations about our family dynamics with increasing directness and specificity. His stroke and recovery period had given him a perspective on family relationships and values that he found both disappointing and clarifying. He could see how quickly family members' concern and attention had faded once his condition stabilized, and how their ongoing involvement was motivated more by obligation and social expectations than by genuine care and affection. He had also become acutely aware of the financial and legal discussions that occurred around him, but without his input, as family members made assumptions about his future care needs and estate planning without consulting him about his own preferences and priorities. These conversations had convinced him that his decision to transfer legal authority to me had been both necessary and appropriate, given the disconnect between his values and his family's approach to his care and resources. More significantly, Grandpa Joe had begun talking about his concerns regarding what would happen during upcoming holiday gatherings, particularly Thanksgiving, which had traditionally been the most important family celebration of the year. He worried that the dynamics that had emerged during his health crisis would create tensions and conflicts during holiday events that were supposed to celebrate family connections and shared gratitude. He was particularly concerned about how my family would respond when they learned about the legal changes he had made, transferring healthcare decision-making authority and financial control to me, rather than leaving these responsibilities with my parents or Ryan. He understood that these changes would be interpreted as evidence of either diminished mental capacity or manipulation on my part, and that family members who had been expecting to inherit portions of his estate might challenge his decisions through legal or emotional pressure tactics. These conversations forced me to confront the reality that the upcoming holiday season would inevitably include confrontations about Grandpa Joe's care decisions and estate planning that could permanently damage family relationships. The legal authority I had been given was not just an abstract responsibility, but a tool that would need to be used to protect his interests against family members who might prioritize their own financial expectations over his well-being and autonomy. The first indication that these confrontations were approaching came in early November, when my mother called to discuss Thanksgiving planning. Her tone was unusually formal and businesslike, suggesting that the conversation involved more than simple holiday logistics. She explained that Ryan and Ashley had offered to host Thanksgiving dinner at their house again this year, continuing the tradition that had been established over the past several years. However, she continued, they had decided to make some modifications to the celebration format that would make the event more manageable and enjoyable for everyone involved. The dinner would be limited to immediate family members only, excluding extended relatives who had sometimes attended in previous years. The timing would be adjusted to accommodate the children's schedules and energy levels, with dinner served earlier in the day, followed by informal socializing, rather than the extended gathering that had characterized previous celebrations. Most significantly, she explained, they had decided that including Grandpa Joe in the celebration would not be appropriate given his recent health challenges and ongoing recovery needs. She emphasized their concern for his comfort and well-being, noting that large family gatherings might be overwhelming for someone who was still adjusting to his post-stroke limitations. They felt that the noise level and activity associated with holiday celebrations could be stressful rather than enjoyable for him. Instead, she continued, they were planning to visit him at Sunrise Manor either the day before or after Thanksgiving, bringing him a special meal and spending quality time with him in his familiar environment where he would be most comfortable. This arrangement would allow him to participate in holiday traditions while avoiding the potential stress and fatigue that might result from transportation to Ryan's house and participation in a larger, more stimulating celebration. The rationale my mother presented was superficially reasonable and could have been interpreted as thoughtful consideration of Grandpa Joe's needs and limitations. but I recognized it immediately as another example of my family's pattern of excluding him from meaningful social participation under the guise of protecting his well-being, while actually prioritizing their own comfort and convenience over his social and emotional needs. When I asked whether anyone had consulted Grandpa Joe about his preferences for holiday celebrations, my mother seemed genuinely surprised by the question. She explained that they were making decisions based on what they believed would be best for his health and comfort, and that involving him in planning discussions might create unnecessary pressure for him to participate in activities that could be detrimental to his recovery process. I pointed out that his recovery had progressed to the point where he was capable of making his own decisions about social activities, and that excluding him from family celebrations without consulting his preferences was disrespectful and potentially harmful to his emotional well-being. I suggested that we should ask him directly about his interest in attending Thanksgiving dinner and work together to accommodate any special needs he might have, rather than making unilateral decisions about his participation. My mother's response revealed the underlying dynamics that were driving this decision. She acknowledged that including Grandpa Joe would require modifications to their usual celebration format, including considerations about accessibility, transportation, timing, and the overall atmosphere of the event. She felt that these accommodations would fundamentally change the nature of their Thanksgiving celebration, and that other family members, particularly Madison and Connor, should not have to adjust their holiday expectations to accommodate an elderly relative's limitations. She also expressed concerns about the practical and emotional burden of managing Grandpa Joe's needs during a family gathering, noting that someone would need to take responsibility for ensuring his comfort, monitoring his fatigue levels, and providing assistance with mobility and other activities as needed. She seemed to assume that this responsibility would fall to me, adding to my existing role as his primary family caregiver, and she questioned whether this arrangement would be fair to me or enjoyable for other family members. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with my mother presenting increasingly elaborate justifications for excluding Grandpa Joe from Thanksgiving, while I argued for finding ways to include him that respected both his capabilities and his limitations. But it became clear that the decision had already been made and that my input was being solicited primarily to secure my cooperation with arrangements that had been finalized without considering alternative approaches. The call ended with my mother asking me to support their decision and to help explain to Grandpa Joe why spending Thanksgiving at Sunrise Manor would be better for everyone involved. She emphasized the importance of family unity during the holidays and expressed hope that I would prioritize harmony over personal preferences in this situation. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment for a long time, processing what had just occurred and considering my options for responding to my family's decision. I could accept their rationale and help them manage Grandpa Joe's disappointment about missing Thanksgiving dinner, maintaining family peace at the cost of enabling their continued exclusion of him from meaningful social participation. Alternatively, I could challenge their decision directly, insisting that Grandpa Joe be included in Thanksgiving celebrations and offering to manage any additional logistics or accommodations required to make his participation successful. This approach would likely create conflict and tension, but it would also demonstrate respect for his autonomy and social needs. Or I could use the legal authority I had been given to make decisions that reflected Grandpa Joe's values and preferences, rather than my family's convenience and comfort. This option was the most confrontational and potentially damaging to family relationships, but it was also the most consistent with the responsibilities I had accepted when I agreed to serve as his healthcare advocate and financial executor. The following day, I drove to Sunrise Manor to discuss the Thanksgiving situation with Grandpa Joe and get his perspective on my family's decision and his preferences for holiday celebrations. I found him in the community room, playing cards with 3 other residents and clearly enjoying the social interaction and friendly competition that had become important parts of his daily routine. When I asked about his interest in attending Thanksgiving dinner at Ryan's house, his face lit up with enthusiasm that made my family's assumptions about his preferences obviously incorrect. He told me that he had been looking forward to Thanksgiving for weeks, hoping that this year's celebration would include more meaningful conversation and connection than the brief, obligation-driven visits he had been receiving since his stroke. He acknowledged that transportation and mobility would require some planning, but he felt confident that these logistical challenges could be managed without creating significant burden for other family members. More importantly, he wanted the opportunity to spend extended time with Madison and Connor, whom he rarely saw outside of brief, uncomfortable visits, and to participate in family traditions that connected him to positive memories and relationships. When I explained my family's rationale for excluding him from Thanksgiving, Grandpa Joe's response was both disappointed and insightful. He told me that he understood their concerns about accommodating his needs, but that he felt capable of managing his own limitations and asking for assistance when necessary. He was more troubled by what he saw as their assumption that his presence would diminish other family members' enjoyment of the celebration, suggesting that they viewed him as a burden rather than a valued participant in family traditions. He also shared his suspicions that the decision to exclude him was motivated by factors beyond concern for his comfort and well-being. He had noticed that family members seemed increasingly uncomfortable with visible reminders of aging and mortality, and he wondered whether his post-stroke limitations made them anxious about their own futures and vulnerabilities. More significantly, he told me that he had been expecting some kind of confrontation about his estate planning decisions, and that he suspected the Thanksgiving exclusion might be related to family members' awareness that legal and financial arrangements had been changed without their input or approval. He had heard references to his situation during brief visits that suggested family members were discussing his care and finances among themselves, and he worried that they were making plans based on assumptions about his resources and decision-making capacity that were no longer accurate. This conversation convinced me that the Thanksgiving situation was not just about holiday logistics, but about broader issues of respect, autonomy, and family dynamics that would need to be addressed directly, rather than managed through diplomatic compromise. Grandpa Joe's exclusion from family celebrations was consistent with patterns of marginalization and control that reflected his family's discomfort with aging and their prioritization of convenience over relationship maintenance. More importantly, his suspicions about the connection between estate planning and social exclusion suggested that upcoming confrontations would involve not just holiday arrangements, but fundamental questions about his right to make decisions about his own care and resources without family interference or manipulation. I told Grandpa Joe that I would use whatever authority was necessary to ensure that his preferences were respected and that he would be included in Thanksgiving celebrations if that was what he wanted. I also warned him that supporting his autonomy might create conflicts with other family members who had different expectations about his role in family decisions and their own involvement in his care and estate planning. Grandpa Joe's response was both grateful and resolute. He told me that he had lived too long and experienced too much to be intimidated by family members who prioritized their own comfort and financial expectations over his well-being and dignity. He was prepared to accept whatever conflicts might arise from asserting his right to make his own decisions about his social participation and financial resources. He also shared his growing awareness that the legal arrangements he had made were not just about protecting his own interests, but about sending a message to family members about the consequences of treating elderly relatives as burdens to be managed rather than people to be respected and valued. He hoped that experiencing some accountability for their choices might encourage them to reconsider their approaches to family relationships and care responsibilities. Armed with clear direction from Grandpa Joe about his preferences and expectations, I called my mother back that evening to inform her that he would be attending Thanksgiving dinner at Ryan's house and that I would handle any logistics or accommodations necessary to make his participation successful. I explained that I had consulted him directly about his preferences and that excluding him from family celebrations without his input was not acceptable. My mother's response was immediate and defensive. She reiterated all the rationales she had presented during our previous conversation, emphasizing concerns about his health and comfort while questioning my judgment in encouraging him to participate. in activities that might be challenging for someone his age with his medical history. When I explained that the decision was ultimately his to make, and that my role was to support his choices rather than second-guess his capabilities, she became more confrontational. She accused me of manipulating Grandpa Joe and using his vulnerability to create conflicts within the family. She suggested that my insistence on including him in Thanksgiving was motivated by personal agendas rather than genuine concern for his well-being. The conversation escalated as she questioned my qualifications to make decisions about his social activities and implied that my involvement in his care had become excessive and potentially harmful. She threatened to contact his doctor to express concerns about his decision-making capacity and to explore options for limiting my influence over his choices. When I calmly informed her that I had legal authority to make healthcare decisions on Grandpa Joe's behalf, and that his mental competency had been professionally documented and confirmed, the silence on the other end of the phone call was profound and telling. This was clearly the first time she had learned about the legal changes he had made, and her shock was obvious even through the phone. Her response, when it finally came, was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and accusation. She demanded to know when these changes had been made, who had been involved in the process, and what had motivated Grandpa Joe to transfer legal authority away from family members who had been managing his affairs. She insisted that he had been manipulated or coerced into making decisions that he wouldn't have made if he had been thinking clearly. I explained that the legal changes had been made at Grandpa Joe's request, with appropriate legal counsel and documentation of his mental competency, and that his decision reflected his assessment of who would best represent his values and preferences if he became unable to advocate for himself. I emphasized that the changes were legally valid, and that challenging them would require evidence of mental incapacity or undue influence that simply didn't exist. The call ended with my mother announcing that she needed to discuss this information with my father and Ryan before determining how the family would respond to what she characterized as a betrayal of trust and manipulation of an elderly relative. Her tone suggested that upcoming family interactions would be confrontational and potentially hostile, but I felt confident that I had both legal authority and moral justification for the positions I was taking. 2 days later, Ryan called me at work, his voice tight with controlled anger, as he demanded an immediate meeting to discuss what he called the situation with Grandpa Joe's legal arrangements. He insisted that family decisions of this magnitude required consultation and consensus, and that unilateral changes to estate planning and healthcare directives were inappropriate and potentially harmful to everyone involved. I agreed to meet with him that evening, but I made it clear that the legal arrangements were not subject to family approval or modification, and that my primary obligation was to represent Grandpa Joe's interests rather than accommodate other family members' expectations or preferences. The meeting took place at a coffee shop near Ryan's office, neutral territory that seemed appropriate for what would likely be a difficult conversation. Ryan arrived with a folder of documents and a legal pad covered with notes, suggesting that he had been researching options for challenging or circumventing the authority I had been given. His opening statement was both accusatory and threatening. He accused me of taking advantage of Grandpa Joe's vulnerability following his stroke to manipulate him into making legal changes that served my interests rather than his well-being. He suggested that I had isolated him from other family members who might have provided alternative perspectives on these important decisions. Ryan also questioned the timing of the legal changes, implying that they had been made when Grandpa Joe's judgment was impaired by medical treatments or emotional distress. He threatened to contest the validity of the documents and to pursue legal remedies for what he characterized as elder abuse and financial exploitation. When he finished his accusations, I responded calmly and factually. I explained that the legal changes had been made at Grandpa Joe's explicit request, with appropriate legal counsel and documentation of his mental competency. I noted that his decision reflected months of observation about family members' priorities and approaches to his care, and that he had chosen to transfer authority to someone who had demonstrated sustained commitment to his well-being. I also pointed out that Ryan's threat to challenge the legal arrangements was exactly the kind of behavior that had motivated Grandpa Joe's decision to make changes. Rather than accepting his autonomy and right to make his own decisions about his care and resources, Ryan was proposing to use legal pressure to override his choices and impose family control over his affairs. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Ryan alternating between attempts at persuasion and barely concealed threats. He offered various compromises that would restore family involvement in Grandpa Joe's decision-making while allowing me to maintain some advisory role. He suggested that my motivations were well-intentioned, but that I lacked the experience and perspective necessary to make complex decisions about his care and finances. When these approaches failed to change my position, he became more direct about the consequences I might face for refusing to cooperate with family preferences. He mentioned potential legal challenges, social consequences within our extended family and community, and the possibility that my insistence on maintaining sole authority over Grandpa Joe's affairs would result in my complete exclusion from family relationships and activities. I responded by explaining that these threats only confirmed the wisdom of Grandpa Joe's decision to transfer authority to someone who would prioritize his interests over family convenience and financial expectations. I also informed Ryan that any attempts to challenge the legal arrangements or pressure Grandpa Joe to change his decisions would be documented and reported to appropriate authorities as potential elder abuse. The meeting ended with Ryan storming out of the coffee shop, clearly frustrated by his inability to intimidate or persuade me to compromise on positions that I considered non-negotiable. But his parting comment suggested that the family had not given up on their efforts to regain control over Grandpa Joe's care and resources. "This isn't over, Emma. We're not going to let you destroy this family over your power trip." The following week brought a series of escalating attempts by various family members to pressure both Grandpa Joe and me to reconsider the legal arrangements and restore their involvement in his care decisions. My parents visited him at Sunrise Manor, ostensibly for a friendly check-in, but actually to express their hurt and disappointment about his decision to transfer authority away from family members who had been caring for him for years. According to Grandpa Joe's account of their visit, they had emphasized their love and commitment to his well-being while questioning whether I had the experience and resources necessary to manage his complex care needs. They had also expressed concerns about the impact his decisions were having on family relationships and suggested that restoring their involvement in his affairs would help heal the rifts that were developing. Ashley made her first visit to Sunrise Manor in months, bringing flowers and photo albums while engaging in casual conversation that gradually shifted toward questions about his satisfaction with current care arrangements and his thoughts about family dynamics. Her approach was more subtle than my parents' direct appeals, but Grandpa Joe recognized it as another attempt to influence his decision-making through emotional manipulation. Even Madison and Connor were deployed as part of the family's campaign, visiting with carefully prepared questions about their great-grandfather's happiness and his relationships with different family members. Their obvious discomfort with the role they were being asked to play made these interactions particularly painful for Grandpa Joe, who understood that his grandchildren were being used as tools in adult conflicts they didn't understand. Throughout these various pressure campaigns, Grandpa Joe remained resolute in his support for the legal arrangements he had made. He told each family member who visited that his decisions reflected careful consideration of his values and experiences, and that he was confident that I would represent his interests more effectively than family members who had demonstrated limited commitment to his care and well-being. But the emotional toll of these repeated confrontations was significant, and I could see that the stress was affecting his health and recovery progress. The family members who claimed to be concerned about his well-being were actually creating anxiety and tension that interfered with his daily routines and social relationships at Sunrise Manor. This recognition led me to make a decision that would escalate the conflict but also protect Grandpa Joe from continued emotional manipulation. Using my authority as his healthcare advocate, I implemented visitor restrictions that limited family members' access to him unless they agreed to focus their conversations on supportive social interaction rather than attempts to influence his legal and financial decisions. The response to these restrictions was immediate and explosive. Ryan called within hours of learning about the new policies, demanding that I reverse the restrictions and accusing me of isolating Grandpa Joe from family members who had every right to maintain relationships with him. My parents drove to Sunrise Manor that same day, only to be informed by facility staff that their visit would need to be approved in advance and conducted according to guidelines designed to protect residents from harassment and manipulation. Their shock and anger were obvious, but facility policies supported my authority to implement such restrictions when necessary to protect residents' well-being. Ashley's response was to threaten legal action against both me and Sunrise Manor, claiming that the visitor restrictions violated family members' rights and constituted abuse of an elderly relative. She consulted with an attorney who confirmed that the restrictions were legally enforceable given my documented authority and the facility's obligation to protect residents from harassment. These developments set the stage for what everyone understood would be a final confrontation during Thanksgiving dinner, when family tensions that had been building for months would reach their breaking point. My insistence that Grandpa Joe be included in the celebration, combined with the visitor restrictions and ongoing conflicts over his legal arrangements, had created a situation where compromise was no longer possible. The week before Thanksgiving, I received a call from Ashley that was clearly intended as a final attempt at negotiation before what she characterized as an irreversible breakdown in family relationships. Her tone was different from previous conversations, less confrontational and more concerned with finding solutions that could prevent permanent damage to family dynamics. She acknowledged that mistakes had been made in how family members had responded to Grandpa Joe's health crisis and recovery needs. She admitted that visitor frequency and engagement levels had been inadequate, and that planning discussions had sometimes prioritized logistical convenience over his emotional and social needs. But she also emphasized the genuine care and concern that family members felt for his well-being and their desire to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by recent conflicts. She proposed a series of compromises that would restore family involvement in his care while respecting my authority and his autonomy. These proposals included regular family meetings to discuss his care needs and preferences, scheduled visits that would provide consistent social interaction without overwhelming him, and collaborative decision-making about major care and financial issues that affected his quality of life and long-term security. Ashley's willingness to acknowledge problems and propose solutions was encouraging, but I recognized that her motivation was primarily to regain family control over Grandpa Joe's affairs rather than to genuinely improve his care and support. The compromises she proposed would effectively undermine the authority he had given me while creating opportunities for continued family pressure and manipulation. I explained that any changes to current arrangements would need to be requested by Grandpa Joe himself, and that my role was to implement his decisions rather than negotiate on his behalf with family members who disagreed with his choices. I also noted that the visitor restrictions would remain in place until family members demonstrated their ability to interact with him in ways that were supportive rather than manipulative. Ashley's response revealed the underlying assumptions that continued to drive family thinking about Grandpa Joe's situation. She insisted that family members had rights and responsibilities that couldn't be eliminated by legal documents, and that elderly relatives needed guidance and protection from decisions that might not reflect their best interests. She also expressed frustration about what she saw as my transformation from helpful family member to adversarial gatekeeper who was preventing normal family relationships and creating unnecessary conflicts. She warned that my insistence on maintaining sole authority over his affairs would result in permanent damage to relationships that had been important throughout my life. The call ended with Ashley's announcement that Thanksgiving dinner would proceed as originally planned, with or without Grandpa Joe's attendance, and that family members would continue working to restore normal relationships despite my efforts to prevent such reconciliation. Her message was clear. The family had decided to proceed with their preferred arrangements, regardless of Grandpa Joe's expressed preferences or my legal authority to represent his interests. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether his autonomy and dignity would be respected or whether family pressure and manipulation would ultimately prevail. On Thanksgiving morning, I picked up Grandpa Joe at Sunrise Manor, helping him into my car with the mobility equipment and comfort items that would make his participation in dinner celebrations possible. He was dressed in his best shirt and tie, clearly excited about spending extended time with family members, despite the conflicts that had been brewing for weeks. During the drive to Ryan's house, we discussed strategy for managing potential confrontations and his preferences for responding if family members attempted to pressure him about his legal arrangements or care decisions. He was prepared for difficult conversations, but determined to enjoy whatever positive interactions might be possible with Madison, Connor, and other family members who had been absent from his life for too many months. We arrived at Ryan's house to find cars already filling the circular driveway and spilling onto the street, suggesting that the supposedly intimate family gathering had expanded to include more relatives than had been mentioned during planning discussions. Grandpa Joe noted the irony that his potential attendance had been characterized as problematic for a small dinner, while additional family members had apparently been invited without similar concerns about logistics or dynamics. Ashley met us at the front door, her smile bright but obviously forced as she welcomed Grandpa Joe and helped him navigate the steps into their house. Her greeting was effusive and solicitous, clearly intended to demonstrate appropriate care and attention to any observers, but lacking the genuine warmth that would have made her concern believable. The living room was full of relatives I hadn't expected to see, including several cousins and their families who had not been mentioned during previous planning conversations. Ryan was holding court near the fireplace, entertaining guests with stories about his latest business successes while Ashley managed logistics and ensured that everyone had appropriate drinks and appetizers. Madison and Connor approached their great-grandfather with shy enthusiasm, clearly pleased to see him, but uncertain about how to interact with someone whose health challenges had been presented to them as severe limitations rather than temporary obstacles to be accommodated. Their obvious affection for him, combined with their discomfort about his physical changes, created poignant moments that reminded everyone present of the relationships that had been neglected during his recovery. The initial social interactions were polite and superficially normal, with various family members greeting Grandpa Joe and asking general questions about his health and comfort. But I could sense underlying tensions and could see family members exchanging meaningful glances that suggested coordinated planning for conversations that would occur later in the day. As we gathered around the extended dining room table for dinner, I noticed that seating arrangements had been carefully planned to separate Grandpa Joe and me from each other, while positioning us near family members who had been most vocal about challenging his recent decisions. The placement was subtle but deliberate, suggesting that strategic conversations were planned during the meal. Ryan's blessing before dinner was longer and more elaborate than usual, emphasizing themes of family unity, gratitude for shared blessings, and the importance of supporting each other through difficult times. His comments about family loyalty and collective responsibility were clearly directed toward current conflicts, though he maintained the pretense that his remarks were simply appropriate holiday sentiments. The dinner conversation began with safe topics like work updates, school activities, and vacation planning, but gradually shifted toward more pointed discussions about family relationships and responsibilities. My Aunt Patricia, who had apparently been briefed about recent developments, began asking questions about elderly care and the challenges of making decisions for family members who might not be capable of managing their own affairs. Her comments were superficially general, but everyone at the table understood that she was referencing Grandpa Joe's situation and the legal arrangements that had transferred decision-making authority away from his children and toward his granddaughter. The implication was that elderly relatives required family protection from their own poor judgment and from outsiders who might take advantage of their vulnerability. Grandpa Joe responded to these indirect attacks with dignity and clarity, explaining, that his recent legal changes reflected careful consideration of his values and experiences rather than confusion or manipulation. He noted that the family members who were questioning his decision-making capacity had demonstrated limited commitment to his care and well-being during his recent health challenges. His directness seemed to surprise relatives who had expected him to be confused or defensive about his choices. Instead, he articulated his reasoning clearly and challenged family members to explain why they believed they were better qualified to make decisions about his care and resources than he was himself. The conversation became increasingly uncomfortable as various family members attempted to present their perspectives on his legal arrangements while maintaining the pretense that their concerns were motivated solely by love and desire to protect his interests. But their arguments consistently focused on their own expectations and convenience, rather than his preferences and autonomy. When Ryan finally addressed the situation directly, demanding that Grandpa Joe reconsider his decision to transfer authority to me and restore family involvement in his affairs, the confrontation everyone had been anticipating finally began in earnest. Ryan's presentation was carefully prepared and professionally delivered, emphasizing themes of family unity, shared responsibility, and concern for Grandpa Joe's long-term security. He acknowledged that mistakes had been made in how family members had responded to his health crisis, but argued that these problems could be corrected through better communication and renewed commitment to his care. He also questioned whether I had the experience and resources necessary to manage the complex decisions that would be required as Grandpa Joe's health continued to decline. He suggested that family decision-making would provide better outcomes than individual authority, even if such arrangements were more complicated to coordinate. But the core of Ryan's argument focused on what he characterized as the unfairness of excluding family members from decisions that affected their own financial planning and inheritance expectations. He argued that Grandpa Joe's estate planning decisions should reflect consideration of family members' needs and circumstances, rather than personal preferences that might not serve everyone's best interests. This final point revealed the fundamental motivation behind family opposition to Grandpa Joe's legal arrangements. They were less concerned about his care and well-being than they were about maintaining control over resources they had been expecting to inherit. Their arguments about family unity and shared responsibility were actually attempts to pressure him into making decisions that served their financial interests rather than his personal values. Grandpa Joe's response was devastating in its clarity and directness. He told Ryan that his comments had confirmed every concern that had motivated the legal changes, demonstrating that family members viewed his resources as their inheritance, rather than his property to manage according to his own priorities. He also noted that their sudden interest in his care and decision-making had emerged only after they learned about the authority transfer, suggesting that their concern was motivated by financial considerations rather than genuine affection or commitment to his well-being. Most significantly, he announced his decision to modify his estate planning to reflect the values and priorities that family members had demonstrated during his recent health challenges. Rather than distributing his resources according to traditional expectations, he would be directing his assets toward people and organizations that had shown genuine commitment to elderly care and support. The silence that followed this announcement was profound and telling. For the first time, family members understood that their behavior during Grandpa Joe's stroke and recovery had consequences that extended beyond social relationships to include financial implications they had not anticipated. As his designated executor, I stood up and calmly explained that Grandpa Joe's estate planning decisions were legally valid and final, and that any attempts to challenge or circumvent his choices would be met with appropriate legal responses. I also announced that effective immediately, all distributions from his estate would be frozen pending review of beneficiaries' conduct and commitment to his values. The remainder of Thanksgiving dinner was tense and uncomfortable, with family members processing the reality that their treatment of Grandpa Joe during his vulnerability had cost them not just relationships, but also financial expectations they had been counting on for their own planning purposes. As we prepared to leave, several family members approached us separately, attempting to negotiate or apologize in ways that might reverse the consequences of their previous choices. But Grandpa Joe's response was consistent. Their behavior had revealed their true priorities, and those revelations could not be undone through convenient apologies. The drive back to Sunrise Manor was quiet but peaceful, with both of us processing what had occurred and what it meant for future family relationships. Grandpa Joe expressed satisfaction that his autonomy had been respected and that family members had finally understood the consequences of treating elderly relatives as burdens, rather than people deserving of dignity and care. 6 months later, Grandpa Joe's estate remains frozen while family members continue their attempts to restore their inheritance expectations through legal challenges and emotional appeals. But the legal arrangements he made have held firm, protecting his resources and ensuring that his final wishes will be respected regardless of family pressure or manipulation. More importantly, his decisions have sent a clear message about the importance of treating elderly family members with dignity and respect rather than viewing them as problems to be managed or resources to be controlled. The family members who failed to meet those standards during his time of need have discovered that their choices had consequences they had not anticipated or considered. As for me, I have learned that sometimes protecting someone's dignity and autonomy requires making decisions that create conflict and tension with people who claim to have their best interests at heart. The legal authority I was given was not just about managing Grandpa Joe's affairs, but about ensuring that his values and preferences would be respected, even when they conflicted with other people's convenience and expectations. The Thanksgiving dinner that was supposed to exclude him because of his limitations instead became the moment when he demonstrated that his judgment and decision-making abilities were not only intact, but had been sharpened by his experiences with family members who had shown their true priorities during his most vulnerable period. Their attempt to marginalize him had backfired spectacularly, giving him the opportunity to hold them accountable for choices they had assumed would have no lasting consequences. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.